"If you beat me at chess, the company is yours," joked the translate. Millionaire CEO to the cleaning lady who was cleaning his game room, sure she didn't even know how to move the pieces. He laughed at his own joke, but his smile disappeared when she accepted the challenge. With an eerie calm, she walked to the board, which was in the middle of an old game, and made a single move. She announced checkmate. The CEO looked confused, and his blood froze. That wasn't just any move. It was his late father's secret move, a move only the true heir of the company would know how to make. Richard Monroe considered himself the king of a glass and steel empire, and his penthouse in Midtown Manhattan was the throne from which he surveyed his kingdom. The city stretched out beneath him, a tapestry of lights and concrete he believed he controlled with the same ease as moving pieces on his chessboard. The game room was his sanctuary, an expansive space with floor-to-ceiling windows where every object was a testament to his wealth and razor-sharp intellect. At the center, under a theatrical spotlight, rested the crown jewel, an ivory and onyx chessboard, a collector's item worth more than the mortgage on half the homes owned by the men who worked for him. The pieces, carved by hand, seemed to guard the secrets of ancient battles, and Richard felt that only he was worthy to command them. His portfolio was vast, a fortune built upon the volatility of the stock market, where he danced with the numbers and turned stocks into ever more capital. That afternoon, the city seemed small. He was immersed in an online game against a Russian grandmaster, an anonymous opponent testing his limits. The screen of his giant notebook displayed the virtual board, but his eyes kept returning to the physical pieces in front of him, recreating the complex maneuver. His lead engineers, on a video conference call, watched in respectful silence. They were brilliant young minds, but in chess, Richard treated them like children. Humiliating them in quick matches was one of his favorite pastimes, a subtle reminder of who stood at the top of the corporate food chain. He cultivated the fame of being a former collegiate champion, like someone polishing an old trophy, a symbol of a genius that, in his mind, transcended business and reached the level of strategic art. It was in this moment of absolute concentration that Mrs. Elena Rodriguez entered the room. Her steps were silent, almost imperceptible, the result of decades of work that demanded invisibility. She pushed her cleaning cart with the quiet dignity of someone bearing a prized tool. Her grey hair was pulled back into a simple bun, and on her face, the lines of expression told stories Richard would never care to hear. She began her work in the furthest corner, her movements slow and methodical. However, passing the center of the room, she stopped. For an instant that seemed to stretch, her eyes, deep and serene brown, landed upon the ivory and onyx board. It was not a look of covetousness, but of quiet, almost reverent curiosity. Richard, with his nose for an audience, noticed immediately. A smirk formed on his lips. Here was the perfect opportunity for his spectacle of arrogance. He cleared his throat, ensuring the microphone clearly captured his voice for the colleagues on the video call. "Enjoying the pieces, Elena," he mocked, the tone deliberately patronizing. "I bet you don't even know how the knights move. Do you? You know what? I'm feeling generous." The snickers from the other side of the screen were the fuel he needed. He stood up, his posture inflated with power, and pointed to the board where the complex match was paused. "Let's make a deal. If you beat me at chess, the company is yours. Ha ha ha." The humiliation echoed through the room, amplified by the virtual guffaws. Seeing that she remained silent, he insisted, condescension dripping from every syllable. "Go on, try. Just one move. Touch the right piece and I'll give you a promotion." Mrs. Rodriguez slowly raised her gaze from the board and looked at him. There was no anger, no shame, only a tired, almost imperceptible sigh. Slowly, she walked around the table. Her calloused hands, which Richard despised as symbols of a life of servitude, hovered over the precious pieces. The world seemed to hold its breath. The engineers on the screen leaned forward. What would this woman do? She ignored the powerful queen and the imposing rook. Her fingers, surprisingly steady, touched the head of an obscure pawn, forgotten in a corner of the board, a piece Richard considered utterly worthless. With a soft, almost ethereal motion, Mrs. Rodriguez's hand pushed the pawn forward a single square. The ivory piece slid across the polished onyx without a sound, a gesture so small, yet so definitive. She then withdrew her hand and turned to Richard, who was watching her with a mocking smile, the face of someone preparing to deliver the punchline. Their eyes met, and it was there, in the unperturbed calm of her gaze, that the first seed of doubt was planted. With a firm voice, devoid of any trace of triumph or irony, she announced to the silent room and the virtual spectators, "Checkmate." Richard's expression froze. The smile dissolved, replaced by a mask of incredulity. "What?" he stammered, letting out a short, nervous laugh. "That's impossible. You're—" He cut himself off, unable to finish the offensive sentence. To him, this was absurd. A poorly rehearsed piece of theatre. Maybe it was a prank by his engineers. He leaned over the board, his eyes scanning the pieces with the speed of a high-end processor, the same brain that analyzed the profitability of complex investments and turned capital into an even greater fortune. He expected to find the error, the flaw in this woman's logic, but what he found made him hold his breath. The pawn, that damned, insignificant pawn. By advancing, it had opened a diagonal line that was previously blocked, and on that diagonal, like a forgotten sentinel, was his bishop. The bishop, now free, drove an invisible spear directly into the heart of his king, but that wasn't all. The pawn's move, in a strike of terrifying genius, had also created a double trap with the rook, which now controlled the king's only route of escape. There was no way out. No piece could block the attack. No piece could capture the bishop. The king was exposed, cornered, sentenced. It was a forced mate in one, a solution so brilliant and yet so simple, it seemed to have sprung from the very soul of the game. A move that neither he, with his champion's inflated ego, nor the Russian grandmaster, one of the world's greatest, had even considered. The silence in the room was heavy, dense. The only sound was the low hum of the air conditioning and the uncontrolled pounding of Richard's heart in his ears. Suddenly, the stillness was broken by an explosion of activity in the video chat. Capital letters flashed on the screen, furious and urgent. It was the Russian grandmaster. "That move! Where did that come from?" he typed. "Only one person in the world made that pawn sacrifice. Who is with you?" Richard's blood ran cold. What was a moment of personal humiliation had just transformed into a public and disconcerting mystery. This wasn't luck. It was a signature. He slowly raised his face from the board, defeat weighing on his shoulders like a lead plate. His eyes searched for Mrs. Rodriguez's figure. She was no longer beside the table. With the same serenity with which she had toppled an empire, she was now walking back toward her cleaning cart, picking up a cloth and a spray bottle. Richard's face went pale. Arrogance vanished, giving way to a creeping terror. A dusty memory, a forgotten name whispered in old chess clubs. An American sports legend who had disappeared without a trace more than 30 years ago began to rise in his throat, suffocating him. He hadn't been defeated by a housekeeper. He had been publicly humiliated by the greatest master the country had ever produced. The name hung in the air, unspoken, a fog in Richard's stunned mind. Lila Vance, the phantom player, the girl prodigy who, in the 80s, set the American chess scene on fire with meteoric talent and then vanished like smoke, leaving behind only legends and memorable games studied by generations. He remembered the stories he heard in the university halls, told in a reverent tone by the chess club veterans. They spoke of a young woman from a humble background who saw the board in a way no one else did, who composed symphonies of attack and defense with an almost supernatural intuition. And her signature move, the one that immortalized her, was the seemingly illogical pawn sacrifice, a bait that invariably led to a spectacular victory. It was impossible. That legend, that myth, could not be the woman dusting his furniture. The cognitive dissonance was so violent that Richard felt a wave of dizziness. His brain, a machine calibrated to calculate investment profitability and analyze the cash flow of his multi-million-dollar businesses, simply could not process the reality. Meanwhile, the video call was still active. A window opened to his global humiliation. His engineers were petrified, their faces a mixture of shock and fascination. The chat with the Russian Grandmaster continued to flash with frantic messages. "Is it her? Are you with Lila Vance?" With a sharp, shaky movement, Richard hit the touchpad and ended the call, cutting the connection to the world that had witnessed his fall. He needed silence. He needed to think. But the silence in the room was even more deafening, filled only by the soft, rhythmic sound of Mrs. Rodriguez's cloth against the window glass. She had returned to her work as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just detonated a bomb in the center of one of the city's most powerful men's existence. Every movement she made was a sting to Richard's wounded ego. Her calm was an insult. How dare she be so serene after blowing up the center of his world? He looked around at the symbols of his victory, his wealth, the expensive artworks, the panoramic view of the city bowing at his feet, the shine of the gold and the trophies. Everything looked fake now, a hollow shell. What value did all that wealth have? All those assets, if the foundation upon which everything was built, his supposed intellectual superiority, was a fraud. He, who prided himself on predicting stock market fluctuations and converting information into more capital, had been tricked by the simplest move, coming from the most improbable person. The humiliation burned in his veins like acid. He wasn't a king in his castle. He was a court jester who just had his paper crown ripped off in front of everyone. The memory of the name continued to torture him, becoming clearer and clearer. Lila Vance, the champion who abdicated the throne. Why? Why would such a brilliant mind be cleaning the floor of his office? The mystery was deeper and more unsettling than the defeat itself. The wounded pride gave way to a visceral need to understand. He needed answers. He couldn't let her simply leave that room, taking with her the secret that had just shattered his world. With his heart hammering against his ribs, he stood up, his legs slightly shaky. His voice, when it finally emerged, was a hoarse whisper, almost unrecognizable. "Lila," he said, the name cutting through the silence of the room. "Lila Vance." The cleaning motion stopped instantly. The cloth hung motionless halfway up the glass. Slowly, very slowly, Mrs. Rodriguez turned her head, and her calm, unfathomable eyes met his. On Mrs. Rodriguez's face, or Lila's, there was no surprise, nor the panic of someone unmasked. There was only infinite resignation, the exhaustion of a soul that had carried a secret for 30 years and knew that one day the weight would become too great. Her shoulders, which seemed bowed by age and work, dropped a millimeter further, as if the mention of that name had added an invisible burden. "That name," she said, her voice low and without inflection, "hasn't belonged to me for a long time, Mr. Monroe." The Mr. Monroe was a subtle blow, a deliberate resetting of the pieces on the social board he had tried to overturn. She was still the housekeeper, and he the boss. But both of them knew that this was now a fragile facade, a theater of the absurd. Richard took a step forward, his body tense, his mind spinning in a whirlwind of questions. How? Why? A champion, the greatest of all, cleaning the floor of my office? It makes no sense. His voice was a mixture of anger and fascination. For a man whose world was governed by the cold logic of numbers, by asset profitability and fear of liabilities, The situation was an anomaly his system could not compute. He wanted answers. He wanted to understand the equation. Lila turned completely toward him, the cleaning cloth still in her hand, like a banner of her present life. Some things aren't meant to make sense, sir. They are simply meant to be lived. Inside her, a storm was brewing. That move on the board, she hadn't planned it. It was a reflex, a dormant instinct that had awakened upon seeing the beauty of the position. For a second, she wasn't Elena, the housekeeper. She was Lila, the artist, and the board called to her. She saw the harmony, the hidden solution, the music only she could hear, and she couldn't resist. It was a mistake, a catastrophic error that threatened to destroy the peace she had built with so much sacrifice. The anonymity that was more valuable to her than any fortune in gold or dollars the man in front of her could accumulate. That man, with his empire of business and investments, would not understand the value of quietude, the price of freedom that came with being forgotten. He saw the world as a series of transactions, of profits and losses. How could she explain to him that the greatest victory of her life had been abandoning the board? "And I don't accept that answer," Richard said, his voice regaining its previous arrogance, but now tinged with a note of desperation. "Everything has a price. Everything has an explanation. How much do you want for your story? Name a number. I'll buy it. I'll consider it an investment in curiosity." The offer was an insult, but it was the only language he knew, the language of money. He was trying to turn this human mystery into a business, into something that could be quantified and acquired. Lila merely shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "You wouldn't understand, sir. You have a great fortune, but there are riches money cannot buy." She turned, intending to resume her work, to dissolve back into the invisibility that had been her shield for so long. But Richard couldn't allow it. This was more than his ego. It was a challenge to his very perception of reality. He couldn't just let her go, let her win one more time with silence. "You're not going anywhere," he ordered, his voice sharp. He walked to the board, the adrenaline of discovery now mixing with the fury of powerlessness. With a swift gesture, he reset the pieces, placing them back in their initial positions. The battle wasn't over. It had just begun. He glared at her, his eyes flashing with a feverish intensity. "We're going to play again, a real match, and with every piece you move, you will tell me a part of your story. That is my price. You don't leave this room until the final checkmate." Lila stared at the reset board, the ivory and onyx pieces gleaming under the light like a battlefield awaiting its generals. Richard's ultimatum hung between them, heavier than the silence that settled in the room. For a long moment, she didn't move. The outside world, with its traffic noise and life, seemed to have vanished. There were only the two of them, and the 64 squares that held the universe of a lifetime. Inside her, Elena, the housekeeper, fought against Lila, the master. Elena screamed at her to refuse, to take her cart and leave, to protect the cocoon of anonymity that had kept her safe for 3 decades. But Lila, the part of her that breathed strategy and saw life in moves and countermoves, knew that escape was no longer an option. This man, with his wounded arrogance, would not leave her alone. He would hunt her down, use his power and money to unearth the past she had sealed so carefully. Paradoxically, the only way to protect her future silence was to speak now, but on her own terms. This game wouldn't be about winning or losing. It would be about control. She would control the narrative. Finally, she nodded, an almost imperceptible movement. "I'll play," she said, her voice calm, but with a thread of steel Richard didn't expect. She sat down in the leather armchair opposite him, a posture of erect dignity that didn't match the image of the subservient housekeeper. He expected pleading, perhaps fear. What he received was the dignity of a queen. Surprised, but feeling he had recovered a fraction of control, Richard sat down. He had the white pieces. The initiative was his. With a quick, aggressive gesture, he advanced the king's pawn 2 squares. The king's opening, a classic, a declaration of intent to dominate the center of the board from the start. It was how he ran his business. An aggressive acquisition, a calculated risk investment to secure market control. His eyes were fixed on hers. Your move, to move and to speak. Leela responded with the Sicilian defense, a solid counterattack, a reply that said, "I will not play your game." Her hand, the same one that moments before held a cleaning cloth, moved the piece with hypnotic precision. She raised her eyes from the board. "I learned to play with my father," she began, her voice soft, transporting them far from that luxurious room. "We didn't have a board like this. Ours was made of cardboard, drawn by hand. The pieces were bottle caps. The king was a wine cork he found in the street. There was no fortune, no net worth to worry about. There were only cold nights and the joy of seeing my father smile when I finally understood the knight's move." The simplicity of the image was a punch to Richard's gut. He, who grew up surrounded by assets and wealth, who measured the value of things in dollars or euros, could not conceive of a world where happiness could sprout from something so devoid of monetary value. He bristled at the simplicity of the story. He wanted the drama, the reason for the flight. "Is that all?" he mocked, impatient. "The poor girl's story. I want to know why you quit." Leila stared at him, and for the first time a flash of fire shone in her calm eyes. "Every move has its time, Mr. Monroe. You made your opening. Now, wait for mine." The tension in the room thickened, transforming the air into something almost palpable. The game proceeded in a charged silence, punctuated only by the soft click of the ivory and onyx pieces. Every move by Richard was quick, assertive, a reflection of his personality in business. He sacrificed pawns without hesitation to open lines of attack, seeking a quick profit, a premature check. It was the strategy of the stock market speculator, always chasing high short-term returns, even if it meant taking huge risks. Leila, on the other hand, played with the patience of a monk. Her moves were economical, precise, building a defensive structure that seemed impenetrable. Each of her pieces supported the other, creating a complex web of protection and potential. She wasn't seeking immediate victory. She was building the foundations of an inevitable triumph. Like a patient investor who accumulates a long-term treasure, trusting in the compound interest of strategy. "You still haven't answered me," Richard insisted. After capturing one of her bishops in an exchange he considered advantageous, he felt the need to break her calm, to provoke her into revealing her weaknesses. "You were a phenomenon. You had the world at your feet. Sponsorships, fame, a guaranteed legacy of glory. Why throw it all away?" The word legacy hung between them. For Richard, it was a concept tied to money, to stocks, to assets to be passed down. He couldn't comprehend the renunciation of a prestigious legacy. Leila moved her rook to an open file, regaining control of the board's center. The bishop she lost was part of a larger plan, a calculated sacrifice that Richard, in his eagerness for gains, hadn't perceived. "The world you describe," she said, her voice still low, but resonating with sharp clarity, "wasn't at my feet. It was on my shoulders." She paused, her eyes fixed on the pieces, but her mind miles and decades away. "I was a girl, Richard, a teenager. My father, he loved me, but he saw my talent as a lottery ticket, a way out of poverty. The clubs, the sponsors, they didn't see a child. They saw an asset, an investment. Every game was a shareholders' meeting. Every victory increased my market value. Every loss was a liability on their balance sheet." The frankness of her words, using his own language, disarmed him. He expected a story of romantic disillusionment, a cliché family drama. Instead, she was describing his world, the same world of capital and business he dominated, but from a perspective he had never considered, that of the product. Chess stopped being music, she continued, moving a knight to a subtle attacking position, and became the sound of a cash register. The pleasure of finding a beautiful combination was replaced by the pressure of generating prestige dividends for others. I wasn't playing anymore. I was performing, and the girl who loved bottle caps was disappearing. Richard was silent. He looked at the board and, for the first time, saw the trap closing. The loss of his bishop, which he had celebrated as a prophet, now revealed itself as a fatal strategic error. Lila's rook dominated the game, and her knight threatened a devastating fork. He had been blinded by greed, by the pursuit of immediate advantage. He looked at her face, at the lines of expression that weren't just signs of age, but of a deep weariness. Her calm was not passivity. It was the result of a war fought and won, an internal war for her very soul. He felt a chill. This woman hadn't simply quit. She had executed the most brilliant and painful move of her life. She had sacrificed the queen to save herself. Checkmate on the board was imminent, but Richard no longer cared. For the first time in his life, he was experiencing defeat on a much deeper level than the strategic. And though, to his surprise, it was accompanied not by anger, but by uncomfortable clarity. Her story, told in fragments between the moves of a match, was more complex than any chess problem he had ever faced. He looked at the woman in front of him, no longer the invisible housekeeper, nor the rediscovered legend, but a real person whose life had been a long and silent sacrifice. He, the billionaire who boasted of his business acumen, of his ability to foresee the future of the market, felt short-sighted. He saw the world in black and white, like the squares on the board, but she saw it in infinite shades of grey. "So that was it?" he asked, his voice stripped of its former arrogance, genuinely curious. "The pressure got too much, and you ran away." Lila made her next move, placing his queen in an untenable position. The end was 2 moves away. "Running away is the word others use," she corrected softly. "I call it a choice, the most difficult and important decision of my life." There was more at stake than trophies and recognition. Her eyes were lost for a moment in the view of the city through the glass wall. There was my younger brother, Michael. He also had the gift, maybe not my intuition, but a prodigious discipline and memory. They wanted to turn us into the Vance siblings, a brand, a double product. But he didn't have my shell. Every loss broke him inside. Every victory filled him with dread of the next match. I watched the light in his eyes dim, being replaced by anxiety. I saw the same vicious cycle that consumed me, but in him the effect was 10 times worse. Our mother, on her deathbed, made me promise to take care of him, not to let the world break his spirit. She paused, emotion momentarily catching her voice. The night I won the national championship, I didn't see joy on Michael's face. I saw panic. He would be next. All the pressure would fall on him. That night, I made my decision. It was useless to have the world if I lost my brother. There was no profitability in that venture. The emotional interest was too high. The next morning, we disappeared. I changed our names. I took the little money I had and hid us in the immensity of the city. I became Eleanor, and he was able, for the first time, to be just Michael, a child. The revelation hit Richard with the force of a wave. That act of altruism was so absolute, so contrary to everything he knew, that it left him speechless. He had always operated based on personal gain, the expansion of his portfolio, the accumulation of power. She had given up everything for love. Suddenly, a random image flashed in his mind, the image of one of his youngest engineers, Liam, a quiet, almost timid young man, but with a brilliant mind for code. Richard often humiliated him in chess, mocking his excessively cautious and defensive playing style. Liam never reacted, only lowered his head with a resigned sadness. "Why think of him now?" Lila continued, her voice lower, almost a secret. "I chose this building, this job, for a reason. The hours are flexible, the pay is fair, and it allows me to stay close, to ensure he's doing well, even from afar. Richard's mind began to race, the pieces clicking into place with dizzying speed. Liam. His mother worked in the building, he'd mentioned it once. The defensive playing style, the risk aversion, the resigned sadness. It wasn't lack of talent, it was a scar, the echo of his uncle's trauma. Richard's pale face lifted from the board, the game's defeat forgotten. His eyes widened. His voice came out as a breath. "Liam, the engineer. Is he your son?" Lila's composure finally shattered, her eyes filled with a panic she hadn't shown in 30 years. The fortress she built around her heart had just been breached. The panic in Lila's eyes was a response louder than any word. The fortress she had erected around her son, brick by silent brick of anonymity over 30 years, had just had its gates broken down. Richard's question was not an attack, it was the key that turned the lock of her greatest fear. For an instant, the air seemed thin, and the luxurious penthouse transformed into a glass cage. The hands that moments before moved chess pieces with supernatural calm now gripped the edge of the leather armchair, her nails digging into the expensive material in a desperate attempt to anchor herself to reality. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The terror on her face was a confession. The son she had protected from the world, the boy she had saved from the burden of crushing talent, worked for the only man who now knew her secret. The man she had just publicly humiliated. The irony was so cruel, so perfectly engineered, that it could only be the work of fate. Richard, in turn, felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The revelation brought him not the satisfaction of having solved a puzzle, but the shock of a collision. Suddenly, the scattered pieces of a mystery coalesced, forming a clear and painful image. Liam, the polite, almost reverent young man who looked away when he passed. The engineer whose logical mind was undeniable, but whose aversion to any form of confrontation or risk made him an easy target for Richard's provocations. How many times had he called him a pawn in front of the others? How many times had he mocked his caution, unaware that he wasn't mocking a weakness, but a deep scar, an inherited trauma, a strange, uncomfortable feeling, which he vaguely identified as shame, began to rise in his throat. All his wealth, his fortune in crypto and stocks, suddenly seemed insignificant. What was the value of all that money if he used it to unwittingly crush the legacy of a mother's sacrifice? "Please," Lila's voice came out as a fragile whisper, breaking the silence. He doesn't know, he knows nothing about Lila. To him, I'm just Elena. His mother, it's all I ever wanted to be. The plea wasn't for herself, but for him, for his peace. She was willing to endure any humiliation, but the idea that the past could touch her son was unbearable. Richard stood up and walked to the window, turning his back on her. The city below, his kingdom, seemed distant, irrelevant. He was in a new kind of negotiation, one where assets were intangible and liabilities could destroy a life. The old Richard, the predator of Midtown, would have seen this as an opportunity, a leverage point to exert power. But the man looking at the skyline in that moment was shaken. Her brilliant move on the board had defeated him. The story of her sacrifice had disarmed him. He had all the power, all the capital to destroy her peace. But what would he gain from it? What would be the profit? For the first time, he found no answer in his calculating mind. He turned around, his face an impenetrable mask. Uncertainty frightened him, and when he felt frightened, he resorted to what he knew best: control. He walked to his desk, Lila's heart pounding in her ears with every step he took. He didn't look at her. He just pressed the intercom button, his voice cold and sharp as steel. "Sandra," he said, the business tone returning like armor, "clear my schedule for the next hour." There was a pause that stretched on forever, a vacuum in which Lila and Liam's future was suspended. Then he gave the final order. "And ask Liam from the engineering team to come up to my office. Immediately, the sound of the intercom clicking off was like the snap of a trap closing. For Lila, the world shrank, becoming only the space between the leather armchair and the solid wood door. Every second of waiting was torture, compound interest on a 30-year debt she never wanted to incur. Her capital of tranquility, accumulated with such effort in the shadow of anonymity, had been completely depleted. She was in total liability, exposed, vulnerable. What was Richard intending? A final humiliation, to fire them both, to expose her secret to her son in front of her, like a trophy of his own cleverness. The cash flow of her emotional stability was collapsing. She looked at the man who now held total control of her life, the billionaire who measured success in profitability charts and business acquisitions, and saw in his eyes something that frightened her more than anger, the icy calm of a strategist who had just found a new and fascinating line of play. Richard, conversely, did not feel triumphant. The shame he felt earlier had solidified into something more complex. Calling Liam was an impulse, an instinctive move in a game whose rules he was learning in real time. He looked at the woman who had sacrificed a legacy of fame for a good he had never valued, another person's peace of mind, and felt like an amateur. His investments in stocks, his crypto assets, his vast portfolio in dollars and euros. Everything seemed childish, a game of accumulating colored points on a screen while she played with life's true currencies, love and sacrifice. The image of Liam, the pawn he moved disdainfully in his mental games, now carried weight. A history. Humiliating Liam had been an investment in his own arrogance, and the dividends now were bitter. A light knock on the door broke the unbearable tension. "Mr. Monroe, you called for me." Liam's voice was hesitant. As always, Richard said, "Come in," and the door opened. The young engineer entered, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze lowered. He stopped abruptly when he saw his mother there, in her uniform, next to the chessboard, her face pale as wax. "Mom?" he asked, confusion clouding his features. "What are you doing here? Did something happen?" Lila couldn't answer. Her throat closed up. She just shook her head negatively, her eyes fixed on Richard, a silent plea that screamed louder than any word. Her look said, "For him, not for me, please." Richard slowly walked around his desk, stopping between mother and son, a triangle of power and secrets. He didn't look at Lila. He kept his eyes on Liam, who looked increasingly lost and frightened. "Liam," Richard began, the tone surprisingly mild, almost paternal. "Your analytical mind is one of the greatest assets of this company. The way you solve complex problems is remarkable." Liam blinked, caught off guard by the praise. Thank you, sir," Richard continued. "I've decided we need to invest more in the well-being and integration of our teams. That's why I'm creating a corporate chess team, and I want you to be the captain." Liam gaped. "Me, sir, but I'm not that good." "I disagree," Richard said. "But every team needs a coach, someone who understands not just the logic, but the soul of the game. Your mother, Liam, showed me today that she has a unique perspective on strategy." He finally turned to Lila, whose heart seemed to have stopped. Liam looked from his boss to his mother, total perplexity on his face. Richard then delivered the final checkmate, a move that targeted not the king, but the very structure of the board. "I'd like to offer her the position of chief strategy consultant for our new chess team, at a director-level salary. Of course, the decision is hers and yours, Liam." Liam's world tilted on its axis. Richard's proposal was so absurd, so out of the orbit of reality, that for a moment he thought he was dreaming or being subjected to an extremely poor corporate prank. His mother, Elena, the woman he saw leaving the house before dawn, her hands already tired, to clean the offices of men like this one, being offered a director position, with a salary that probably far exceeded his own engineer's income. Logic, the pillar of his existence, crumbled. He looked at his mother's pale face and saw a fear he had never seen before. It wasn't the fear of someone worried about bills at the end of the month. It was a deep, existential dread. A protective instinct, strong and primitive, surged within him. He took a step forward, subtly positioning himself between his mother and the CEO. "Mr. Monroe, with all due respect," he said, his voice firm despite the confusion, "I think there's a big misunderstanding. My mother, she's a housekeeper, not a chess strategist." He felt his face burn with embarrassment and anger. This could only be a cruel form of humiliation, a power play by a bored multimillionaire. Lila felt her son's protective gesture and it broke her heart. She had raised him to be a good man, and there he was, trying to protect her from the very secret she was keeping to protect him. She needed to end this now. "My son is right, sir," she said, her voice regaining a little of its strength. "I appreciate the offer. It was very kind, but I cannot accept. I'm not the person you are looking for. If you'll excuse us." She took Liam's arm, a silent command for them to turn and leave, to get out of that room, that building, perhaps that city. The flight instinct that had guided her 30 years ago screamed again. Peace was her only treasure, her most precious asset. And this man threatened to liquidate her entire portfolio of tranquility with a single, extravagant job offer. She could not allow the ghost of Lila Vance to touch Liam's life. The price was too high. "It's not kindness, Eleanor, and it's not a misunderstanding." Richard's voice cut through the air, stopping them. There was a new authority in his tone, not that of the arrogant boss, but of the game master who refuses to allow the opponent to abandon the board. He walked slowly and stopped in front of them, blocking the way. He looked directly at Liam. "I understand your confusion, but what you need to understand is that in this company, I don't invest in resumes. I invest in talent. That's how I built my businesses. That's how I turned capital into fortune. Today, I saw your mother demonstrate a problem-solving ability that is a priceless asset. This is not an act of charity. It is a business proposal, an application in a human resource with the highest potential for profitability." He spoke the language of investment funds and stock market shares, trying to translate a human miracle into terms the corporate world could understand. He knew he was playing with fire, but retreating was not an option. The match had become too interesting. Lila pulled Liam's arm again, panic now visible in her eyes. "Liam, please, let's go." But the young man didn't move. Richard's words, though strange, didn't have the tone of mockery he expected. There was a disconcerting seriousness in his gaze. He was confused, torn between his mother's urgency and the offer that, bizarre as it was, could change her life forever. He looked at the board, at his mother's tense expression, at the CEO's unreadable face. There were pieces there he couldn't see, a game beneath the game. His logical mind searched for a pattern, a piece of information that could make sense of it all. And then he remembered, in the midst of the conversational chaos, a detail, a dissonant word his brain had registered. He frowned, looking directly at his mother. "Mom," he began, his voice low and uncertain. "Why does Mr. Monroe keep calling you Lila?" The name Lila hung in the air, heavy and strange. For Liam, it was like hearing a word in a language he should know but couldn't decipher. The panic in his mother's eyes intensified, and she took a step back, as if the name itself were a physical force pushing her away. The silence that followed was the loudest Liam had ever experienced. It was the silence of a vault being broken open, the silence of a 30-year secret disintegrating under the pressure of a single question. He looked from his mother to Richard, his analytical mind desperately seeking a logical explanation. A childhood nickname, a case of mistaken identity. But his mother's reaction denied any simple explanation. That word was the key to the locked door he didn't even know existed in his own home. Richard realized he had made a tactical error. In his attempt to control the game, he had exposed the most important piece on Lila's board without adequate preparation. Now, he needed to manage the consequences. He saw the pain on her face and the confusion on Liam's, and he knew that arrogance would no longer serve. He needed another tool. Lila was her name, Richard said, his voice calm and deliberate. In another life. He paused, letting the weight of the phrase settle. A life before you were born, Liam. A life where your mother didn't clean conference rooms. She commanded them, not with money or stocks, but with an intellect so powerful it made men like me look like beginners. Lila closed her eyes tightly, a solitary tear escaping and tracing a path down her tired face. The secret was out. The phantom she had kept chained for so long was now free in the room, visible to the only person she wanted to hide it from. It was another person, she whispered. Her voice choked, more to herself than to them. That person no longer exists. But Liam barely heard her. Richard's words spun in his mind. Commanded rooms. Powerful intellect. He looked at his mother, at her calloused hands, at her simple uniform, trying to reconcile the image he knew with the woman Richard was describing. It was like trying to fit two puzzle pieces from different boxes. They simply didn't match. I don't understand, Liam said, his voice low, frustration growing. What are you talking about? What other life? Richard approached the chessboard and picked up the white king. He held it between his fingers. Chess, Liam, the game of kings. Your mother wasn't just a player. She was the queen, the greatest this country has ever seen. Lila Vance, a legend who disappeared at the height of glory. I wasn't offering a job to your mother, the housekeeper. I was trying to hire back a legend for my company, because I recognize an asset of incalculable value when I see one. The full revelation, brutal and unadorned. There was no more room for doubt. The confusion on Liam's face turned into mute shock. His mouth opened slightly. He looked at his mother, and for the first time in his life, he saw her as a stranger. The woman who taught him to tie his shoes, who made his favorite meal when he was sick, who worried if he was wearing a coat, was a legend, a queen in disguise. Lila finally found her voice, a shaky voice, but filled with the strength of a desperate mother. I did it for you, my son, she said, extending her hand, but not daring to touch him. So you could have a normal life, without the pressure, without the burden, so you could just be Liam. But her words seemed distant to him. He took a step back, distancing himself from both her and Richard. His mind, the same mind Richard praised for its logic, was short-circuiting. His whole life, his memories, his own aversions and cautious nature, everything was being recontextualized in real time. He wasn't just the son of Elena, the housekeeper. He was the son of Lila Vance, the legend, and this heritage, which he never knew existed, suddenly seemed to explain everything. He looked at his mother, not with anger, but with a new and terrifying intensity. So, he said, his voice barely audible, my whole life was a lie. Liam's question on my whole life was a lie, was not an accusation, it was a verdict. And for Lila, the sentence was complete devastation. The sound of those words was more painful than any defeat, more final than any checkmate. The sacrifice of her entire life, the renunciation of fame, prestige, a potential fortune, all done to build a shield around her son, had just been perceived by him as a betrayal. She had protected him so much that she had left him defenseless against the truth. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. What could she say? How to explain a love so absolute that it chose self-erasure as its greatest expression? Any word would sound like an excuse, a justification for the lie he now saw as the foundation of his existence. The portfolio of trust she had built with her son over 20-odd years had just gone bankrupt. and she felt like the poorest person in the world. Richard watched the scene, feeling like an intruder in a sanctuary he himself had violated. This was a type of negotiation he was unprepared for. There were no spreadsheets, no cash flow analysis, no profit projections that could calculate the value of what was being broken there. It was a conflict of purely emotional assets, and the liability was a lifetime of pain. He, the billionaire accustomed to moving the market with a phone call, felt powerless. For the first time, he understood that true power did not reside in the ability to acquire assets, but in the ability to protect what one loved. And he, in his arrogance, had stripped this woman of her only true wealth, her son's peace. The shame he felt earlier returned, but now it was heavier, mixed with a reluctant respect and an uncomfortable need to try to repair the damage. Liam, in turn, felt the ground dissolving beneath his feet. His identity, which he had always considered a constant, a solid foundation, turned out to be a variable. His caution, his innate dread of competition, his preference for the safe logic of code over the unpredictable confrontation of human interactions, were they traits of his own or symptoms of the life imposed upon him? He felt a surge of resentment, not just for the lie, but for the choice he never had. Who could he have been if he had known the truth? Maybe he would have loved chess. Maybe he had the gift. Or maybe the pressure would have destroyed him, as his mother feared. He would never know, and this uncertainty was an abyss opening within him. He looked at his mother, the woman who loved him unconditionally, and saw a stranger whose greatest decision had excluded him completely. Seeing the abyss widen between them, Lila knew words were useless. The logic of emotion was different from the logic of reason. She needed to speak the only language that could, perhaps, translate the complexity of her choice. The language that had started all this, her tear-filled eyes fixed on the ivory and onyx chessboard. Slowly, as if in a trance, she approached the table. Her trembling hands hovered over the pieces. Richard and Liam watched her in silence. Not understanding what she would do, she did not look for a position of attack or defense. Instead, ignoring the logic of the game that was still set up, she picked up her own king. With a deliberate movement, she placed it in the center of the board, completely exposed, vulnerable to multiple attacks. Then she picked up the most humble piece, a pawn, and placed it protectively in front of the king, although the pawn had no power whatsoever to save it in that position. She raised her tear-streaked face to her son, her voice a trembling thread of sound. "Sometimes, my son," she said, "to protect what is most important, you have to sacrifice the king, not the queen. You sacrifice yourself." That simple gesture on the chessboard was more eloquent than 1,000 words. The sacrificed king, the most important piece, abdicating its power to protect the most humble one. Liam looked at the exposed ivory king in the center of the board and then at his mother, whose face was bathed in tears and a vulnerability he had never witnessed. In that instant, the resentment he felt dissolved, replaced by an overwhelming wave of understanding. It wasn't a lie. It was an abdication. He hadn't been deceived. He had been the treasure his mother hid from the world. Her whole life, she had played the longest and hardest game, not for profit or glory dividends, but to ensure the safety of her most precious asset. His caution, his aversion to risk, were not weaknesses. They were the result of her success. They were proof that her sacrifice had worked. The inheritance she gave him was not a famous name or a talent for chess, but something infinitely more valuable, the freedom to be just himself. Slowly, he took a step forward, closing the abyss that had opened between them. He extended his hand, not to the board, but to her. His fingers touched her face, wiping away the tear that still marked her skin. "Mom," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion that was finally unleashed. "I'm sorry." There were no more questions, no more pain over the lie. There was only gratitude for a love so deep that it was capable of moving kingdoms and erasing names. Lila collapsed into his arms, the weight of 30 years of loneliness and fear finally finding a place to rest. Their embrace was the final checkmate to the suffering, the resolution of a conflict that had lasted a lifetime. Richard watched the scene in reverent silence. He, the billionaire who understood assets and liabilities, who had built an empire on the cold logic of numbers, was witnessing a transaction of incalculable value. That hug, that forgiveness, was a type of wealth that could not be measured in dollars, euros, or crypto. It was a net worth of love, built on the interest of sacrifice and an investment of a lifetime. For the first time, he felt poor. His penthouse, his artworks, his stock market fortune, all seemed hollow, lifeless. He had accumulated possessions, but the woman in front of him possessed a richness of spirit that made him look like a beggar. He had understood everything wrong. The goal of the game wasn't to accumulate pieces, it was to protect the king. And he didn't even know what his was. When mother and son finally pulled away, Liam's eyes met Richard's. There was no more confusion, just a new and serene confidence. "Mr. Monroe," Liam said, "my mother and I appreciate your offer, and we accept." Lila looked at her son, surprised, but he gave her an encouraging smile, a smile that said, "It's okay, we don't have to hide anymore." Liam continued, addressing Richard, "But with a few conditions. The position won't be for Lila Vance, the legend. It will be for Elena Rodriguez, my mother. She won't be a coach to compete, but a mentor to teach about strategy, about patience, and about how sometimes the best move is knowing what you're unwilling to sacrifice." Richard nodded slowly, genuine respect in his gaze. This was not a business negotiation, it was a peace treaty. "The conditions," he said, his voice more humble than it had ever been, "are perfectly acceptable." He extended his hand, not to the son, but to the mother. "Eleanor, it would be an honor to have you on our team." For the first time in 30 years, she shook a stranger's hand without fear, not as the housekeeper, nor as the legend, but simply as herself. The months that followed transformed Richard Monroe's penthouse from a sanctuary of arrogance into a center of learning. The game room, once a stage for humiliations, now housed the strategy club, as Elena preferred to call it. The ivory and onyx board remained at the center, but it was no longer an altar to one man's ego. It had become a tool for the minds of many. Twice a week, engineers, analysts, and even interns gathered there, not to prove who was best, but to learn how to think better. Elena, with her infinite calm, guided the sessions. She used chess openings to explain project planning, middle game tactics to illustrate risk management, and endgames to teach the importance of perseverance. She didn't teach them how to win, but how to see, how to understand the consequences of every move, both on the board and in life. Her director's salary was real, but the true profitability of her work was seen in the company environment, which became more collaborative and humane every day. Richard was the most diligent student. He had abdicated the throne of the invincible player and sat among the others, listening with a humility no one had ever thought possible. He was learning to calculate a different type of wealth, one that was not measured in stock market charts or crypto quotes, but in the strength and loyalty of his team. He discovered that his company's true capital was not in his assets or financial holdings, but in its people. And by investing in them, by treating them not as pawns, but as valuable pieces, the profit he obtained was something no money could buy, genuine respect and a purpose that went beyond accumulating wealth. His businesses, surprisingly, prospered even more, guided by a broader and more patient vision. Liam flourished, captain of the club. He was the perfect bridge between his mother's analog wisdom and his colleagues' digital mindset. The shadow of the lie had dissipated, revealing a confident, articulate young man and a natural leader. The peace of mind his mother gave him as an inheritance was now his greatest asset, allowing him to face challenges with a calm and clarity that impressed everyone, especially Richard. He and his mother talked for hours, not just about the past, but about the future. He learned the story of Lila Vance not as a legend, but as the journey of a courageous young woman who became his mother, and he loved her all the more for it. Elena's longest game had reached its conclusion, and the result was not a victory or a defeat, but a beautiful and harmonious peace. On a rainy afternoon, Elena and Richard watched Liam play against a young engineer. The match was intense, but the atmosphere was one of camaraderie. The young man made a bold move, sacrificing an important piece for a promising attack. Richard leaned forward, the old competitive instinct surfacing for a second. "A mistake," he whispered to Elena. "He'll lose the rook." Elena smiled gently, her eyes fixed on the board. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps he's learned that some things are worth more than a rook." In that moment, she looked through the glass wall at the tapestry of city lights beginning to illuminate. The city that had once been her hiding place now seemed like a garden of possibilities. She was no longer a fugitive, nor a rediscovered legend. She was just Elena, Liam's mother. Mentor to brilliant minds, a woman who had sacrificed her king and each in the process had won the world. The greatest move of her life had not been a brilliant checkmate, but the silent advance of a pawn called love, which, against all odds, had traversed the entire board to crown itself with peace.